What's on your mind today?
All right,
what
so
else?
I posted at the blog, and I told a couple little stories. These are a few stories that recently came up in another conversation that I was having, and I thought, you know, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So I had two people that told me different stories at different times about different things, and it was very strange to me that, in essence, they are the same story. So one person told me a story about how she is able to predict bad things will happen. So she knows when a bad thing is going to happen because she gets this foreboding feeling that something bad is going to happen. And she was telling me a story about, you know, about this event that occurred in her life. And she said that she went to a restaurant with her with the person that she was dating at the time, and they sat down and they got their menus and they were looking at the menus, and she got this horrible feeling that something awful was going to happen. And so she told him right away, we have to leave, something bad is going to happen, like I have this really bad feeling, we have to get out of here. And so they left the restaurant, and that's where she stopped. And I said, well, okay, so what happened? You know, I'm waiting to hear. Like the roof collapsed. The next morning in the paper, the headline was that the building caught fire, or it was robbed by armed robbers and people were injured, or
if that did happen, you still want to be careful with that
power.
I
know, but I'm waiting to hear it.
I've seen the Final Destination movies.
Oh, I thought you were going to say it still doesn't mean that you have,
well, no, but I'm saying
feelings,
if you get away from the roof collapsing in the restaurant, you're still marked for death later, just because you cheated death with a premonition.
It doesn't stop. Yeah, it comes at you like the Terminator. So then I'm waiting to hear, like, did everyone get food poisoning? Was it like, what happened? And she goes, well, nothing, that's it. And I'm like, so you left the restaurant and nothing happened at the restaurant? Like, I didn't quite understand how that validated her feeling to her. Like, I don't know how it validated it. And so it was interesting because that was a kind of unique story for me, because most of the times people will tell you like something horrible happened, and that's why I think that I have this power to predict bad events or whatever. But it's like wearing an anti-elephant hat or something. It's like, I don't see any elephants around here. I guess it's almost like when people say they have prophetic dreams, right?
Yes.
And they call up and they say, well, I dreamt my aunt was going to die, and then I found out my aunt had died that night or whatever. And what if they just said, I dreamt that, someone died, and then that's the end of the story? Mm-hmm. I mean, how is that impressive? And so then I later had someone tell me a story, and they said that they were an empath, right? That they had the capacity to pick up on negativity from other people, whether a person defines that as some sort of like wooish capacity to pick up energy from others, or whether they're just simply saying, I'm very attuned to the cues that people give, socially when they're not happy or not feeling well. It's up to the person, but they described themselves as an empath and said that they learned this one day when they were walking outside, and they were walking outside and they had this horrible, awful feeling, and they felt really bad and they didn't know why. And they realized that this feeling had come on as they walked past another person who was going the other direction. And so they said, I recognized at that point that I must have picked up on the bad feeling that this person was having, like whatever horrible thing was happening with them in their life, I must have picked up on that, and that was why I then felt really badly. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I said, so why did they feel really bad? And she said, oh, I didn't go talk to them or anything. And I'm thinking, then how do you know that the person even felt bad? Like, how would you, what if you've had this bad feeling as you walked past a building, right? Would you be thinking this building must have, so maybe someone must have been murdered there 20 years ago because I felt really bad as I walked past the building.
That sounds like the easiest and laziest style of confirmation bias. It's like, you have a feeling and you decide what it means, and you don't even try to check it out.
Even though it's simple, right?
I mean, I can imagine a slightly more advanced form of that where they go up to that person and talk to them, and then they basically badger that person until they find out what something in their life that's bugging them.
What is it? Yeah.
Because there is not a person walking down the street in the world who doesn't have something that's weighing on their mind a little bit, right?
But these are very weird stories. Like these are unique to me. Like, I have not heard lots of people tell tales like this. Most of the callers or people that contact us have this sort of, at least they get the response they expected, and then they sort of assume that it all goes together, right? Mm-hmm. But in this case, there's just the assumption with no reason for it. It's such a weird, slight, I can't even put it together. It's like you're saying.
It's a validation of how they want to think the world works.
Would they have had to, for example, get into a car accident on the way home in order to think like, oh, maybe or would they say that was the bad thing? You know what I mean? Like,
that's the point. If something bad does happen to them, then that validates what they were thinking, because they're like, oh, I knew something bad was happening because I had this premonition. Right, but if nothing bad happens, then it's like, I guess I just avoided the bad thing.
Yeah, I couldn't think of, like, how would you falsify a thing like that? Like, what would make them doubt this assumption that they're making? And I don't know what it is, because what caused them to make the assumption, I can't even figure out.
Yeah, and it's very similar to the way that nothing can invalidate the idea that things that happen are God's will. Like, thank goodness that God saved the one person's life from the plane crash in which everybody else died. God must have been working their life. Like, short of complete extinction of the human race, there is nothing so bad that it can't be attributed as God's special favor or something. And this is just sort of a more vague, spiritual, wishy-washy version of that.
People put way too much into feelings. Right? Like, I'm not down on feelings. I like feelings. I have feelings, they
are illogical.
Help life be fun, but
I think feelings are great, personally.
Yeah, I'm down with feelings, but I don't sit around trying to imbue them with, what is the word I'm looking for? Imbue? Is that a word?
Yeah.
Imbue them? Is that the one I'm trying to think of?
Totally a word.
All kinds of, meaning that isn't there. I mean, there's no reason to think that they have more meaning beyond just a response to whatever's going on. And sometimes it's like a weird response, like these people were saying, they get these feelings that can come out of nowhere, right? Like, you could just be suddenly sad. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to have a real obvious trigger. There's all kinds of things that go on in your brain. I can't imagine anybody who's ever gone through a PMS week wouldn't understand that you can have some wacky feelings. I mean,
so a lot of people suffer from depression, and they are very used to feeling sad all of a sudden for no reason.
Maybe you just ate something weird, like too much. What is it? I think it's. I can't even think of what it is. There's a couple of foods that have like a real heavy impact on your hormones. And, you could just have eaten too much of that one night. Or like, what was it Scrooge said? It's a bad bit of
tryptophan from turkey makes you sleepy. But I don't think that's what you're after.
I'm thinking, what I'm thinking of is tofu has a hormonal kind of response to it if you eat too much of it. Yeah. So anyway, just, it was just some weird stories. I don't know why people think that way.
Right. And I mean, it's weird also when they say this to you, like, okay, Miss Logical Atheist.
Well, I honestly don't think that they were doing that, and I don't think that these two people, well, one of them knows I'm an atheist, doesn't have a problem with it. One of them doesn't even know my position on that. So it was just kind of out of the blue that these stories were told. They were very generically told. But I guess what kills me too, though, is, especially in the first case, I mean, you have a person here who has dreamed up this thing out of nothing. And now it's actually driving decisions that she makes in her life. Can I have a dinner? No, because I had a feeling, so now I can't have dinner out. We have to go home and eat because, feeling. And so I'm just looking at this like, this is impacting the decisions that you make in your life.
Yeah, well,
I mean, if
people's brains evolved to hunt down patterns, and that's
these
why
aren't even
that's
patterns.
Why,
Is what I'm
no,
saying.
but
Like,
I know they're not actually patterns, but
I had a bad feeling.
They are perceived that way. Like this person picked this weird feeling out of all the experiences that she's had and chose to see that as significant in some way.
Right, but for no reason. I could even understand if she said when I was 4 years old I had that feeling and something bad happened, and so now I think something bad is going to happen every time I have that feeling. But
right.
It's not even that. Like the story that gets told ends with and nothing happened.
Right. But the reason
reason
it makes no sense to you is because you're not used to looking at the world in the way that she does.
But
I don't know how she looks at the world.
I don't look at it how she does. But
yeah.
Even when I was religious and I put all kinds of stock in how I felt and thought God was sending me messages and whatever, I still felt like the outcomes mattered. Like the outcome had some bearing on the... You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I mean, whether you believe in God or not, I think that says something about your personality type. And people, it's weird to everybody that other people don't think like they do, because we don't get to step outside of our own heads. And I feel like when I talk to a lot of people on the show, I do not relate to the way that they think a lot of times. But although I try over the course of a conversation when we're talking to somebody to kind of get inside their head and not necessarily agree with what they're saying or validate the way they're thinking, but at least to understand that they're coming from a vastly different perspective than I am.
But even when it comes to the fallacies, when you hear somebody start to explain why they are reasoning the way they are, and you start to hear a fallacy, I understand. It's like, okay, I see the mistake you're making. But in these cases, I don't even see the mistake they're making, because there's nothing there. It's like, what are you even tying to this? I don't even understand what they're tying to it that makes them think what they think.
Think culturally about all the movies there are where somebody has some kind of special feeling and it means something, and that is like an indication that person is special and has magical powers. I mean, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Planet Alderaan blows up and he's like, I just heard billions of voices crying out. It's like people want to believe that they have that special power.
But that connects to a real event, though.
Right.
I mean, so even if he was wrong, we could say, oh, he had this horrible feeling, and he had it in sync in time with when this huge, horrible event happened, and so that's why he thinks that this is connected.
Right, but I think people who think that way kind of believe that there is some kind of reality underlying that feeling, even if it's not demonstrated in some way. Like, to them, I would speculate that the strength of the feeling itself is proof that something is happening out there in the real world.
I can't speak.
I know,
for it.
I don't relate to it either, but I think that's the way a lot of people think. But I'm saying, even in the examples
that you give, there's always this, at least something to it. Or when somebody figures out they have a superpower, there's an event that sort of demonstrates it at the beginning, where they're like, whoa, did that really happen?
But when Alderaan blows up, that is dramatic irony, because we, the viewers, have just seen a second ago that Alderaan was blowing up. Obi-Wan Kenobi doesn't have that direct experience of having seen the previous scene in the movie, but because he is an old man imbued with magical powers by the plot, he knows that he finds it worth mentioning to Luke, hey, I just heard billions of voices crying out.
Right.
And I think a lot of people want to think that their minds are special, that they are the chosen one in some way, or that there's a God who personally connects to all of them. And so when they feel a strong feeling, they must think, oh, I need to voice this because obviously this means something.
Well, if there's anybody out there that used to think this way that doesn't anymore, if you could go to the blog and explain it.
Sure.
Like, what was it that in your head confirmed to you that this type of feeling was meaningful?
Dan Barker had a story. I think he repeats stories a lot in his books, but I first read it in Losing Faith in Faith, and I think he also mentioned it in Godless. When he was a Christian, he heard these voices in his head. So he was driving somewhere, and the voices were like, "Turn off the road. There's something really important that you need to see." And he, drove to a specific spot where the voices were telling him. He got out of his car and walked in the middle of a cornfield, and then he waited around, and nothing happened. And then he just went back to his car.
Right.
And this is something he remembers now, but it was years and years before he became an atheist. He didn't think, "Oh, that's weird. I guess I was mistaken, or there's no God," or something.
What did he think?
It still stuck with him for a long time that something significant had happened, but he just didn't know what it was. Instead of, he was primed by his religion to think that God will talk inside your head and tell you important things.
All right.
Maybe you just, I don't come from a religious background. I've never had
Well, I do, but
an
I've never,
experience like
this
that.
is like something I'm not
Yeah,
familiar
maybe
with.
you come from a different kind of religious background.
Maybe.
I don't know. It would be interesting to know how much of that is cultural
This is
and how
less
much of it
religious,
is
though, than
is
kind
the
of
way-
like a belief almost in psychic ability. This is less
Right.
about like religious thinking. Not that there's not parallels, but I'm just saying that this is people that seem to think they have some kind of a psychic capacity.
Right. But a lot of that is cultural because we have a lot of entertainment that presents psychic people. It's sort of like I heard once after like the idea of aliens and sci-fi took off in the popular culture. After that, all of a sudden, people were being abducted by aliens all the time in
Right.
these stories. Like, people absorb it, and it's part of their psyche.
Yeah.
So I would bet, and maybe you could ask your friend, but maybe it would come across as rude and condescending.
That's what I'm always like thinking
Yeah.
when I think it. I ask like, what happened? And then when they say nothing, I'm sort of like, oh,
Right.
okay.
But I would bet that they had this feeling that it was some kind of psychic message.
Clearly. All right. Well, that's all I had.
That was interesting.